Hello, it's Paddy from creativemedia.org.uk, a small media production business based in Bristol, UK. Now, about 2 years ago, I did a comparison between the Canon 650D and the Huawei P9 phone, asking the question, do you actually need to carry an SLR around with you? Or is a small phone just as good for taking pictures with? Since then, we've been lucky enough to update our devices. Amanda, who used to have the P9, now has a Huawei P20 Pro, and I've updated my 650D Canon SLR to an 80D Canon SLR. I'm still using the same Tamron 17-50 zoom lens, f2.8. We thought the best way to test these out would be to have a bit of a shootout day, so clutching our respective devices, we headed off to the world-famous Eden project in sunny Cornwall. Will the difference be obvious, or will we have to agree to differ on our favourite picture-taking device? I hope it won't drive a rift between us. Firstly, I'll talk about the ease of use of both devices. Of course, the Huawei has a big screen, and all the camera functions are there on it. You slide them to the left and to the right. All the normal controls are there in the Pro mode. Film speed, shutter speed, aperture size. It's very obvious that the P20 has a very small lens. Just the lens on my Canon camera probably weighs more than the whole phone. The P20 camera claims to have f1.8. I'm not sure how scientifically correct that is, but it'll certainly do a shallow depth of field. The Tamron lens goes down to f2.8 maximum aperture. The advantage of the SLR camera is that most, not all, of the controls have their own dedicated switch. You can turn the autofocus on and off on this Tamron lens without even turning the camera on. And the battery life, of course, is going to be a lot better on the SLR because it's not running a screen all the time and it's not being a telephone like the telephone is. Annoyingly, the 80D does not have an external control for white balance. You have to use a screen for that, which surprises me. I guess you're meant to be shooting in RAW all the time, where you don't actually have to think about the white balance mode until after you've taken the picture. But I do think it's useful to be able to choose your white balance based on the actual conditions you're shooting in, because if you're editing RAW pictures afterwards, you might not actually know whether it was sun or shade or cloud or artificial light, and you might choose the wrong white balance mode. Of course, the P20 Pro has a big advantage in that it's a lot more subtle. If you want to take a picture without being noticed, then it's easy to pretend you're actually just on the phone or having a look at your social media rather than taking a picture. With the 80D, it's very obvious you're taking pictures. The physical noise of the mirror raising in itself makes a noise, so you can't be silent with this camera, and the autofocus will make some noise as well. On the other hand, if you want to look professional, then showing up at a wedding shoot with just a phone is not going to look good. Even if the pictures you take are very good, I don't think you're going to be taken very seriously. Not yet anyway. Maybe as people realise you can take very good pictures from a phone, it might become more the norm. But I think at the moment you're expected to have lots of things dangling around your neck if you're being paid to take pictures. So let's award some points. Ease of use is probably even, I'd say, and looks as well. On one hand, you've got the professional look of your SLR, and on the other hand, you've got the subtle convenience of the P20 Pro. And another advantage of the P20 Pro is you can take a picture in a very small space. You can get it very close to what you're taking a picture of. I'll show you an example later on of where the size of the P20 enabled a picture to be taken which the 80D just could not take. Battery life definitely is the point to the 80D. It has to do so much less than the P20 Pro, and you can take a lot of pictures without using the screen at all, and the screen is one of the things that uses the most power on any device. Let's look at some pictures. The first test at the Eden project was to take some pictures of a waterfall. Here's the shot on the P20 Pro. I'll zoom right in. All the pictures in this example are not retouched at all. They just came straight out of the cameras. They're not shot on RAW, they're just JPEGs at the best quality the camera can take, or the phone can take. Now, to be fair for this shot, my partner Amanda doesn't take so many shots as me. I'm more of a camera geek, so I may have had a bit of an advantage in setting my camera up for the shots. But this one here from the P20 Pro is very overexposed. What we were trying to do here was to get a blurred shot to show the motion of the water, and so we've got a lot of overexposure. We've not got a full range of shades. This is the histogram here. If I drag this in to show the full range of shades and get a bit more black in it, it looks a bit better. The rocks are nice and sharp, and the leaves are sharp, fairly sharp anyway, given this is quite zoomed in. But there's some rather nasty looking artifacts, I think, here in the water. It just doesn't look very nice. It looks quite pixely and unpleasant. If we compare that to some of the pictures from the Canon, this has come out a lot better. All these pictures were handheld as well. You'll notice there's a bit of noise here in the water, a bit of red and green blobs there. But I think as a picture, this one works a lot better. Let's have a look at the camera data from the P20 Pro. This claims to have had a whatever this number is, of a second at f1.8. I'm not sure if I'm going to be very convinced by any camera data coming out of the P20 Pro. That could be the real shutter speed, but it might not be. The Canon shot here was shot at 1/10 of a second, f16. So that's going to be a big advantage for the focus. So this isn't the most fair comparison really, because shooting at f16, the focus is going to be a lot better than shooting at f1.8. Another picture from the Canon 80D. Again, it's got some blobs there, a few blobs of red and green, which will need some cleaning up. But it's a very nice picture. This has really not got a very good range of shades. If I pull those in, the picture improves a lot. But it does mean it's lost its dynamic range a bit. And here, this is looking a lot noisier now. You might well be able to see kind of red and green blobs of noise in here. But if we zoom out, and this picture is big, it's 4000 by 6000 pixels. So unless we're going to print this very large, these pictures are quite usable. And I'd say the 80D wins on showing a sort of blurred motion picture. There's my last one from the 80D. Zoom out a bit. And that's got a really nice picture showing the motion of a waterfall. That one actually has got the full dynamic range. I'll see what kind of camera data we've got here. That's 1/5 of a second, 1/32, so that will be nicely in focus, should be throughout. There's probably going to be a bit of motion blur. If I look at these leaves, yeah, there's definitely some motion blur here, because this was handheld again. If I'd shot this on a tripod, that would have been much better. Now let's look at Bokeh, if that's the right way to pronounce it. Bokeh is a Japanese word, I think, which means the quality of the out of focusness, if that makes sense. If you're any kind of creative photographer, you probably know about aperture and the uses of it. If you use a large aperture, only a small part of the picture will be in focus. A narrow kind of depth of picture is called the depth of field, and the rest will be out of focus. Now, different lenses give you a different quality of out of focusness. This picture is on the P20 Pro. You zoom in, we can see reasonably sharp on the flower. And let's see what the out of focusness is like. This is nice and sort of soft, almost as if you'd sort of smeared Vaseline all over the lens to make it all blurry. That looks quite nice. But as I get down into these darker bits, I don't know if you can see on the YouTube channel, but there are stripes across here. Lots of stripes and quite a nasty kind of graininess. And I was all for giving this the bokeh crown, but now I'm not so sure. Here's a similar picture on the Canon 80D. I'll zoom right in again, and this is very nicely sharp. I think probably sharper than on the P20 Pro. The background is quite grainy. That's the downside. But despite the grain and a bit of noise, it doesn't have those nasty stripes which we were seeing on the P20 Pro. So even though this kind of reddish blobs here are quite unpleasant, they definitely need a bit of tidying up, either with some extra blurring or with some noise reduction in Photoshop. I think it's kind of more realistic than these stripy bits we were seeing down here. I think I'll just give the Canon the point for bokeh. Another one from the Canon. This one's got some points of light which have turned into big round blobs. On some lenses you can see this as big hexagons. You can actually see the blades of the iris which controls the aperture. I don't know on the P20 Pro quite how it does its aperture, whether it actually is a physical iris or whether it's something more electronic. Again, these dark spots on the Canon are a bit noisy, but there's no strange stripes which I was seeing on the P20. And again, I've got a good dynamic range on this picture. The P20 Pro also has quite a good dynamic range. It's got the full range of colours and shades there. Before I finish with the bokeh, here are two pictures we took of a bird behind some netting. And a popular trick on an SLR camera is to get your aperture as big as you can get it, focus on the thing you're shooting at, and the netting will pretty much disappear. You can see this is kind of quite a bit blurry and a bit faint, because this bit here is a line of netting. There's a bit more netting up there, but it's almost totally blurred out. And if I apply a few curves and levels and things to this, you can almost be convinced that there's no netting there. The way the P20 does it is just by being small enough to fit between the netting. The lens is so small that you can just shoot through the netting and you don't have to bother with that trick at all. Not a brilliant picture. This is very low light, and you can see this has made a real mess of the low light. It's done a lot of automatic things inside the phone, and this isn't a wonderful picture. Then again, neither is the other one. Now I'm going to go on to close-ups. We took quite a lot of these, and of course the lens I'm using on the 80D isn't a macro lens. It's not designed for super close-ups. It's got a minimum focal length of about 10 centimeters, so you can get very close, but it's not a proper macro lens which gives you enormous magnification at that kind of closeness. So first I'll show you a few of the pictures I took on the 80D close-up. Here are some pictures of a paper sculpture, and if I zoom right in as close as I can get, focus isn't wonderful. Again, this was handheld, and at 1/40th of a second, f2.8, so it was a quite dark place to get a picture. It's not bad, and it's got a reasonable dynamic range there. The pull in those ends a bit, that'll improve it somewhat. Another similar one, again, a bit of camera shake, a bit of out of focusness. Just need a bit of sharpening, and again the dynamic range isn't all there. This is quite a good ladybird picture, and there's some very nice bokeh in the background, nice out of focusness which isolates the ladybird against the background. And a close up of some embroidery. The focus isn't wonderful, but it's usable. Quite a good picture of a bee. Not absolutely perfect, but pretty good. And if I use it at a slightly smaller size, very useful. Another bee, that's even better, I think. Quite pleased with that. And the bee was moving, so this wasn't shot at a super slow great. 1/640th of a second, f4. So the Canon is allowing me to get these pictures. Again, not a perfect picture, but if I zoom out a bit, it looks quite nice. Another B. That's fairly sharp, considering. And the 80D does have the advantage of having a fast shutter speed for taking a lot of pictures and getting the one which really works. So let's move on to the P20. I think in general, the P20 is the close-up king. This is fairly sharp. Focus isn't wonderful, but again, if we zoom out, it's got a reasonable dynamic range. We pull that in a bit and do a bit of sharpening, then that starts to look quite usable, really. Another close-up of this rusty surface. Again, quite usable. This ladybird is very good, but when I zoom in like that, you can see it's doing a few automatic things to this, and suddenly it doesn't look quite so good. Just the quality of the picture is very noisy. A lot of noise here. Some quite unpleasant things. But if you zoomed out, it does look pretty good. Again, quite a lot of noise on this flower. This close-up of the embroidery is very good. But again, if I zoom in, you get to see some quite odd lines along here which don't look real, don't look realistic. It's definitely been doing a bit of post-processing inside the phone. These paper shots are a lot closer than I could get from the Canon. Let's see how this picture looks really close. That looks quite good close up even. A bit of noise, and has a dynamic range, not wonderful. And you can see the noise increases a lot as I drag the dynamic range to the full range there. So definitely the P20 gets the Macro King award. And look at that, that's really close. You can actually see the fibres on the cut paper there a bit. So how are the B pictures? Again, this is a horribly noisy picture. I think a digital zoom was used, and that's not a good looking B. It's not a happy B, even though it looks okay from a distance. In fact, it doesn't even look good from a distance. That's an unhappy B with some seriously digital zoomy things going on in it. And that's an attempt at the B, but the focus was bad and it's noisy. Actually, I'm having my doubts now about the Macro King thing. If you want something just to put on Facebook, of a close-up of something which is never going to be displayed close-up like I'm doing here, then yeah, the P20 is brilliant. But if you want something that actually looks good zoomed in, if you compare that to my Canon B, full size, and that's my P20B, and yeah, I know which B looks happier to me. Okay, next. Low light pictures. I have a suspicion that the P20 might do better than the Canon. So let's see. So here's a selfie shot in a very dark stone building with just a skylight at the top. That looks pretty impressive. Looks a bit terrified as well. If we zoom right in though, it's been doing things to the picture. There's some sort of strange grain there, but it's fairly realistic looking grain. Apart from there's an odd red and green line going down here, which definitely isn't on Amanda's face usually. And I think that's a lesson from the kind of high-end phone cameras, that even though you you can get some quite good quality pictures out of them, you'll get odd artifacts if you look closely, like that red and green line there, like the lines I was talking about in the out of focus bokeh as well. On an SLR you get a much more honest kind of graininess, but it's consistent, you don't get any oddities. That's one of me. Again, that's very dark, but you can actually read some of the writing on the Eden Project leaflet in my pocket. But there's a lot of odd edges going on there. And a bit of, I think they call it chromatic aberration. The purple fringes on the edge of high contrast. Which shows that the lens isn't quite as good as you might hope. Here's a similar low light picture in the same conditions from the 80D. And that is really looking nasty. If I zoom right in. So this is a fairly slow exposure, 1/10 of a second, f2.8. It's at ISO 16000, which is, I think, the highest the camera will do. And there's a lot of noise, but the edges of things aren't so strange. I think I do prefer the P20 picture in this low light, and it really was dark. We could just see each other, but hardly. Here are two pictures shot in a bit more light. You can see the P20 was able to get a bit closer. I'll just see what the focal length was on the 80D. That was at 36mm, so I wasn't fully zoomed in to 50mm, so I could have gotten a bit closer. P20 Pro's got a pretty much full dynamic range from white down to black in that picture, which is good. The 80D hasn't quite, it's missed out some of the blacks. The P20 Pro claims an ISO speed of 80, which is not a standard ISO. Still the same shutter speed at f1.8. That's looking quite good close up. And let's see how the 80D fares. That's quite blown out. It's not wonderful, it's a bit out of focus. They're both not bad pictures. If I zoom right in on the window here. I think the 80D looks a bit better for the quality of image. And the out of focus bits, they're fairly comparable. There's nothing obviously horrible on the P20 here, nor on the 80D. But I'd marginally give a point to the 80D, I think, for that image compared to the P20 one. But it's a bit hard to compare given that two different people took the picture. I've got a few miscellaneous pictures to look through. Stone sculpture from the P20. Looks very nice. And it's picked up the texture very nicely on this lumpy egg. Pretty good picture, I would say. Nothing obviously horrible about it. And a quite good dynamic range. I could pull that back a bit. Looks like a submarine. And that's really quite a good picture. Just check the edges of things. Yeah, no complaints about that. Another P20 picture of a paper sculpture. Quite noisy, that one. Not a bad dynamic range, but missing a bit. Let's pull those in. Yeah, a bit noisy there, but not bad. Get that full screen so you can see it properly. A bit overexposed in places too, but you can see the contrast between the brightest bits and the darker bits. Another P20 landscape picture. It's got some nice colours. It looks a little bit kind of washed out, even though it's got a full dynamic range. Maybe it had the wrong white balance mode. Focus is quite good. Another advantage of the small lens of a camera phone is that there's a lot less surface to get dirty, so it's easier to keep that clean. Quite often I notice big blobs on the lens of my SLR camera. This is another landscape from the P20 Pro. Again, doesn't seem to have any kind of pop to it, but that's what Photoshop's for. Details look good. There's no obvious weird things that the camera processor is doing to it, so that looked quite promising. And this is yet another landscape from the P20 Pro. It's got a good depth of focus there. Everything looks reasonably sharp. From close up to the distance. Here's the same stone sculpture on the 80D. This picture is really not as good at all. It's a reasonable dynamic range, but focus seems wrong and it's overexposed. And that might just be down to me taking a bad picture. I can see here the shutter speed was fairly slow, but probably not slow enough to blame everything on camera shake. This is a bit of a silly one, the selfie test. Even though the 80D does have a screen which will swivel round, so I can see myself when I'm taking a picture, the focus is not particularly easy when you're on a live view using the screen. So, and you can see I'm holding it with two hands in this picture, but it's not a bad shot. Of course, the camera phone with its front-facing camera is designed for selfies, and Amanda was able to set the shot up with the reflection in the glasses. Of course, the selfie camera tends to be less good than the main camera lens. The P20 only has a single lens rather than the dual lens on the front of it, but it's not a bad picture all the same. Interestingly, this picture here is a lot bigger than the other ones, so I'm wondering whether the other pictures were taken in a lower mode, or possibly they were using a digital zoom and it was only using a part of the picture. Sorry, I don't have the actual technical details with me to explain that. Our penultimate test was to try and freeze motion. So we're back at the waterfall again, trying to go for a fast shutter speed. This has had a reasonable effort at freezing motion. Again, I think this might be using a digital zoom, I'm not sure. Because the picture is only 2700 by 3600, not that big of selfie picture we saw. Yeah, the motion is frozen reasonably, and there's a full dynamic range, but it just doesn't really pop as a picture particularly. Another one here, it's just a bit blurry. Can we believe the shutter speed? No, we can't. It's not really working as a freezing motion camera. Here's frozen motion from the 80D. Even super zoomed in, it's a bit blurry here, but if I zoom out, it's pretty good. That's with no curves or sharpening or anything. Dynamic range is quite good, almost full, with a bit of curves and a bit of sharpening, and a bit of zooming out. That's quite a good picture. That was shot through a telephoto lens. I did take along a f2.8 Tamron 7200 lens as well. So that was handheld, but at 1/13,000th of a second at f4. So I think on this, the Canon definitely wins for freezing motion over the P20. And lastly, telephoto. This is shot on the P20, and it's not bad. It does look like there's some digital zoom going on here though. It looks a bit more like a drawing rather than a photo when I'm close up. Dynamic range is fairly good, but it's not kind of super high quality close up. Another one here. Again, it kind of looks a bit more painterly. If I zoom in further, it doesn't look like a proper photo to me. So it's good for social media, but not for National Geographic. This is from the P20 again. It's just not good for getting the picture of the bird. On my Canon, I got a much better picture. The focus isn't wonderful on this picture because it was handheld and awkward. It's 1/60th through a 200mm lens, which is a bit of a slow shutter speed to be zoomed in that far. So there may be some motion blur rather than actual focus problems. The 80D is definitely the winner on telephotos. It's just easier to get the shots, and when you do get the shots, the quality of the image is much better. If I zoom in on these leaves, you'll see that they're kind of They look nice and bright and sharp, but they're kind of lacking quality a bit, I think. You can see on the edges here there's a lot of noise and artifacts, digital artifacts. So that's the end of my P20 Pro versus 80D camera phone versus SLR update. It's not 100% conclusive. You can look at the scores here. If you're a good photographer, you can get good results from both cameras. The P20 Pro definitely wins out with convenience. It's a camera you can have with you all the time, and you can get a shot at any time, which will be not bad and maybe usable for prints or for web. But if you want really good results, generally the SLR is the thing to go for. And if you want to look pro, definitely the SLR is the thing to go for. I hope that's been useful. I hope you weren't hoping for a definite answer about which is best. So enjoy your photography, whichever device you choose to use.